In 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his power. But his greatest mistake, it wasn't the Russian winter.
You see, it wasn't Russia, it wasn't the brutal winter, it was his own economy. Power, conflict, security. Who really pulls the strings? Welcome to Chameleon, where we cut through the noise and dissect the forces shaping our world. I'm Leandro Trevisol, an expert in international relations and security studies from London Met. And in this space, we don't just report events, we question them. Who benefits from war? What are the real stakes behind diplomacy? And is security ever truly about protection or control? If you're ready to challenge narratives, expose hidden agendas, and rethink global power structures, you're in the right place. Let's get into it.
In 1799, France stood on the brink of chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, crushing the failing government and ending the revolution. The consulate was born, not as salvation, but as the first step toward empire. War raged across Italy and Egypt as France battled the Second Coalition for dominance. By 1811, Napoleon's empire cast its shadow over Europe. His family ruled stolen thrones, and the continental system strangled trade. But rebellion grew, Spain burned, and Russia waited. Though he stood at the height of his power, the empire's foundations had begun to crack.
I will unveil why Napoleon was forced to march upon Russia, why destiny left him no other path but war. The invasion of Russia had the ultimate objective of destroying, once and for all, the British Empire. There was nothing to do with speculation behind the relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I. Napoleon had only one objective: to weaken the British economy until they begged for mercy. There was no better time to invade Russia than in 1812. The British Empire was in ruins. The economy was severely damaged by the Continental Blockade. Britain was also fighting against the United States for its territories in America in 1812. The internal economy was inflationary, and there was great unrest in the financial markets. Furthermore, on the western side of the French Empire, Spain was completely dominated and had surrendered. Napoleon only needed to take Russia to finalize his masterpiece and stop, once and for all, Britain's economy, hurting its overseas trade. Before Napoleon's era, a significant portion of Britain's revenue came from the East Indies, primarily through the monopoly of the British East India Company. By 1800, the East India Company's economic activities accounted for nearly 50% of Britain's total GDP. The company's control over trade and taxation in India and other Asian territories made it a critical pillar of Britain's economic strength. Around 20% of its revenue came from America, while 7% originated from the Caribbean. Additionally, 6% was derived from Canada and Britain's African colonies. Before Napoleon's era, 17% of Britain's revenue was generated through trade routes across Europe. In past years, Britain's revenue from trade with European countries has declined from 17% to less than 2%, a massive blow to the British economy, all due to the Continental Blockade imposed by Napoleon. Russia began to quietly distance itself from Napoleon's continental system, reopening trade with Britain. In January, on the western side of the French Empire, Britain, led by the Duke of Wellington, increased their incursion into Spain's borders, preventing Napoleon from taking over Portugal, an old British ally. By the end of January, the Duke of Wellington defeated French troops at the siege of a fortress located at the Spanish border. However, Napoleon was focused on another task: regrouping the majority of his battalions together with his allies and assembling one of the biggest armies the world had ever seen.
Russians. That little boy Alexander really thinks he can fool me. How adorable.
In Britain, domestic politics were dominated by war expenditures and economic difficulties. However, Britain was keen to keep investments flowing to the western front of Napoleon's empire. Russia was being forced by Napoleon to comply with the Continental Blockade. Fears of an invasion began to rise, and Alexander initiated military defensive plans. Napoleon, on the other hand, was growing tired of the Russians and began to mobilize his army. The Treaty of Paris was signed with Prussia and 20,000 troops were promised. Britain was maintaining its anti-Napoleonic stance, while also strengthening diplomatic ties with Russia and Sweden. Napoleon was in full preparation mode for the Russian campaign. He pressured Austria into an alliance. This culminated in another Treaty of Paris, 14th of March, 1812, between France and Austria, where Austria agreed to supply 30,000 troops. Troops were gathering in Poland and eastern Prussia. The Russian military began strategic positioning in the western provinces, modern-day Belarus, Lithuania. British diplomacy intensified with Russia and Sweden as it became clear Napoleon would soon invade. The British were also funding and encouraging Prussian and Austrian resistance, even if unofficially. The siege of Badajoz, led by Wellington, was successfully completed on the 6th of April 1812. This was a major victory for Britain in the Peninsular War. Napoleon issued detailed orders of movement for the Grande Armée, which was assembling in Poland and East Prussia. By mid-April, the logistical build-up peaked. French forces under Marshal MacDonald began organizing their northern flank in the Baltics with Prussian support, while Marshal Davout prepared the central push through Poland. Russia also reached strategic alignment with Sweden, securing its northern flank, allowing the Tsar, Alexander I, to focus resources on Napoleon. Wellington's forces advanced into central Spain, aiming for strategic cities like Salamanca and Madrid. Napoleon issued final strategic orders and personally began moving east to command the Grande Armée, leaving Paris around 9th of May. On 11th of May, 1812, Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated. His death caused temporary political instability, but Britain remained committed to fighting Napoleon. The Grande Armée, now nearly 600,000 strong, was on the move toward the Niemen River, which marked the border with Russian-controlled lands, modern-day Lithuania. Russian forces continued to fortify their positions in Vilna, Vilnius, Minsk, and Smolensk. By June, Napoleon had already spent 400 to 500 million francs, while France's total annual revenue was around 900 million francs. The time had come. Napoleon had everything in his favour. The British Prime Minister had died, and there was political and economic instability in Britain. It was the beginning of summer, and the weather conditions were brilliant. What's more, on the 18th of June, the United States entered into war against Britain. Russia would no longer receive full support from the British. France's revenue had also been affected by the Royal Navy's blockade against French commerce overseas. Throughout 1812, Britain was cutting France's trade supplies and deeply hurting French revenue. Final arrangements were made. The Grande Armée was stationary near the Niemen River, close to Kovno, now Kaunas, Lithuania. Bridges were built overnight.
How many? 100, 200,000? I think is near to 120,000.
On the 24th of June, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River. No resistance was encountered. He marched towards the Russian camp, which was stationary near Vilnius. The Russian First Western Army retreated eastward from Vilna, avoiding battle with Napoleon's central force, and moved toward Vitebsk, then Smolensk, destroying supplies, bridges, and depots along the way.
I will stop you right there, for this was Napoleon's fatal mistake. This is the turning point from glory to ruin. 4 days into the invasion, a city was taken, yet no goods were found. 5 months of military preparations and half of France's annual revenue had already been poured into this war. Now, the Russians were dragging Napoleon's army deeper into their vast and unforgiving territory. Time is money, and the longer it took to defeat the Russians, the more funds would be required. By July, France was already struggling to sustain the war effort. Soldiers needed their wages, allies demanded theirs, and all the while, the Russians burned everything in their path as they retreated, leaving nothing behind. We all know Napoleon's fate, but what I want to tell you is this: the invasion of Russia was necessary, and the timing was perfect. However, Napoleon failed to recognize the discipline and strategic depth of the Russian military. It wasn't the winter, it wasn't the Russians alone. Napoleon's fatal mistake was that France's economy was not robust enough to sustain such a prolonged military campaign. It lacked the financial resilience and logistical coordination to continuously supply his forces with ammunition, artillery, and most critically, the capital needed to pay allies and soldiers along the way. Napoleon went to war to save the French Empire's economy, but before he could succeed, it was the economy that ultimately destroyed him.
Buenas noches, mi amor. Duerme bajo el rosal, con las manos en cruz.